The Rupert Murdoch-owned and editorially Trump-supporting Wall Street Journal could not ignore the obvious this weekend. And so the Wall Street Journal's top headline today was as positive to Donald Trump as possible. U.S. left isolated at G7 summit. Wall Street Journal editors know that they will be immediately fired by Rupert Murdoch right now if they put the word humiliated in that headline. And so they chose isolated, which is the kindest possible and still accurate description for what happens to Donald Trump at global summits. Donald Trump flew off to the G7 summit this weekend after a day of rage tweeting about China's response to the illegal Trump tariffs. Everyone at the G7 knows that the Trump tariffs are illegal because they know that under American law and international trading rules, the American president is only allowed to raise tariffs as a matter of national security. So the Trump tariffs on Chinese washing machines, which have nothing to do with national security, are illegal, patently illegal, and so are the rest of the Trump tariffs, which have nothing to do with national security. Tariffs can be raised and lowered by Congress for any reason, but the president's authority to do so rests entirely on national security. Since China is not really a democracy, President Xi of China can do whatever he wants with tariffs, and so Donald Trump was shocked that China's response last week to Donald Trump's September 1st scheduled increase in tariffs on Chinese goods was new tariffs by China. Fighting tariffs with tariffs is something that always happens in trade wars. And so Donald Trump was the only person in the world surprised by China's new move on tariffs. In one of his rage tweets on Friday, Donald Trump used an exclamation point to say that China's tariffs are, quote, politically motivated. All tariffs on the planet are now and always have been politically motivated. And so the Trump response was, of course, to increase the illegal Trump tariffs. And then on Sunday, in what you can be forgiven for thinking was his continued attempt to hold on to the title of most humiliated person in the history of global summits, Donald Trump said he not only has second thoughts about his illegal tariffs, he has second thoughts about everything.
Any second thoughts on escalating the trade war with China?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Second thoughts?
Might as well. Might as well.
You have second thoughts about escalating the war with China?
I have second thoughts about everything.
Second thoughts about everything. Well, we know just from the public record that he has had second thoughts about most of his wives and most of the people who he has hired to work in the White House, but he has never had a public second thought about his big lie about our trading relationship with China.
China's been taking out of this country $500+ billion a year for many, many years. Many, many years. It was time to stop.
It doesn't have to stop, and it's not going to stop, because if it did stop, it would create a global depression, which is what the G7 is worried about. It's not going to stop because America loves what it gets for the money that Donald Trump says China is taking from us. Donald Trump tries to pretend that China just takes the money. Chinese producers of goods take our money and give us the goods that we want. The Chinese-made washing machines or iPhones or athletic shoes and jeans and so on and so on and so on. And that's the way international trade works. And everyone at the G7 except Donald Trump knows that. And everyone at the G7 except Donald Trump knows that the Trump tariffs and trade war with China are threatening to slow down the global economy. And so everyone at the G7 was trying to, at minimum, cause Donald Trump to have second thoughts about his tariffs. But now that Donald Trump is back home, he will have third and fourth thoughts about his tariffs. Donald Trump has inverted the American political and diplomatic tradition of not criticizing the president on foreign soil. The president he criticizes, of course, is Barack Obama. Donald Trump is apparently haunted by the knowledge that Barack Obama was fully respected by everyone at global summits as the most powerful person in the room, and fully respected intellectually, and fully respected for his judgment in international affairs. Donald Trump knows he has none of that respect, and so he desperately reaches for it. And in his reach, he exhibits why he deserves no respect on international affairs from anyone and why he will never get it.
A certain section of Ukraine that you know very well, where it was sort of taken away from President Obama. Not taken away from President Trump, taken away from President Obama. President Obama was not happy that this happened because it was embarrassing to him, right?
Wrong. What you just said is embarrassing to you. Number one, you obviously cannot remember the part of Ukraine that was seized by Vladimir Putin, Crimea. Everyone there knows that Donald Trump no longer has the neurological capacity to retain facts like that, if he ever did. Everyone at the G7 knows that Donald Trump does not have the basic necessary mental capacity for the job of the American presidency, and that was on display all weekend. And everyone at the G7 and around the world knows that the United States and President Obama never possessed Ukraine or Crimea, and therefore it could never have been taken away from President Obama. Here is all of the land on the planet that is in any sense under the jurisdiction of the President of the United States. And here is where Ukraine is. Saying a certain section of Ukraine was taken away from President Obama is exactly the same as saying that France was taken away from President Franklin Roosevelt when Nazi Germany invaded France before the United States entered World War II. Donald Trump was trying to humiliate President Obama, but the joke is always on Donald Trump, because every word of what Donald Trump said about President Obama humiliated Donald Trump by displaying his limitless ignorance to the world. The presidency is an oral exam, and Donald Trump fails that oral exam every day. It is always Donald Trump's publicly self-inflicted wounds that hurt him the most. No one paints Donald Trump into a corner better than Donald Trump. Watch him do it today, when Yamiche Alcindor kept pressing him on the lies Donald Trump was telling about President Obama today. And just as a neurological sidebar, notice that Donald Trump is able to insert the word Crimea in his answer only at this point, because he's just heard it in Yamisha's question.
And I say, how does that work?
Misleading statement that Russia outsmarted President Obama.
Well, he
when
did.
Other countries have said that the reason why Russia was kicked out was very clearly because they annexed Crimea. Why keep repeating what some people would see as a clear lie?
Well, it was annexed during President, I know you like President Obama, but it was annexed during President Obama's term. If it was annexed during my term, I'd say, sorry, folks, I made a mistake, or sorry, folks. President Obama was helping Ukraine. Crimea was annexed during his term. Now, it's a very big area, very important area. Russia has its submarine. That's where they do their submarine work, and that's where they dock large and powerful submarines, but not as powerful as ours and not as large as ours. But they have their submarines. And President Obama was pure and simply outsmarted. They took Crimea during his term. That was not a good thing. It could have been stopped. Could have been stopped with the right whatever. It could have been stopped. But President Obama was unable to stop it, and it's too bad. Go ahead.
The right whatever. It could have been stopped with the right whatever. That's what President Obama should have done to prevent Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine and seizing Crimea. The right whatever. That's what Donald Trump says he would have done. The right whatever. If that's your answer in your oral exam for your PhD in international relations, you're not going to get your PhD. If Donald Trump gave that answer on a TV game show, even Trump voters would know Donald Trump is going to lose that game show. Everyone at the G7 is reading the polls in the United States that give them every reason to hope that Donald Trump will only be attending one more G7 meeting. And they know that the next president to attend the G7 meeting after Donald Trump will never say that the solution to anything is the right whatever. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.